Before we set sail, let me tell you why this story is strange. In England, there are statues of this man, streets named after him. The Queen herself knighted him on the deck of his own ship. And in Spain, the king put a price on his head that would be millions today. To them, he was nothing but a pirate, a thief. They called him El Drake, the dragon. Same man, same voyage, same treasure. So tonight, get comfortable, close your eyes if you like, and drift with me through the life of Francis Drake, the sailor who robbed the greatest empire on earth and got knighthood for it. This is Lost Voyage.
There was a ship that never went anywhere. It lay on the mud of an English river, the Medway, its timbers gone soft with age and water, its masts long since taken down, and inside its hollow belly a family made its home. The vessel had once carried things across the sea, but those days were finished, and now it served only as walls and a roof for the poor, a dwelling that rose and settled a little with each tide, as though it still dreamed of sailing. In this strange cradle, in the years around 1540 and the decade that followed, a boy grew up listening to water move against wood, learning before he learned anything else that the sea was close, that the sea was patient, and that the sea could carry a person far away from whatever they wished to leave behind. The boy's name was Francis Drake, and he had been born inland, in the green and rolling country of Devon, into a family of modest farmers and lay preachers who held to the new Protestant faith with the firmness of people who had little else to hold. When religious unrest swept through the west of England, when the old faith and the new traded power and the countryside grew unsafe for those on the wrong side of it, the Drakes left their home and went east, and they came at last to the river and to the abandoned hull that would shelter them. It was not a promising beginning, and yet from that quiet, waterlogged start would come one of the most extraordinary voyages in the history of the world, a journey around the entire globe, and a campaign of raiding so persistent and so costly that it would shake the wealthiest empire on earth and make its planner the most celebrated and the most hated mariner of his age. To understand what Drake would become, one must first understand the river of silver that flowed across the world in those years. For it was that river he would set himself to divert. Far to the west, beyond the Atlantic, in lands the Spanish crown had claimed and conquered, there were mountains of silver. In the high, cold air of the Andes, at a place called Potosi, a single mountain yielded ore in quantities that defied belief, and the metal was dug and refined and stamped into coins and bars by the labor of countless people, many of them native to those lands and pressed into the work against their will. Many of them brought from far away in conditions that the gentle telling of this story cannot soften and should not try to. The silver came down from the mountains on the backs of animals and the backs of men, and it crossed the narrow waste of land at Panama, and it gathered in the ports of the Caribbean, and then, once a year, it sailed for Spain in great convoys called the treasure fleets. This silver was the lifeblood of the Spanish Empire. It paid for armies in the Low Countries and ships in the Mediterranean, and the vast machinery of a crown that ruled over more of the earth than any power had ruled before. And all of it crossed the open ocean, slow and heavy and tempting, guarded but never guarded enough, and any sailor who learned the rhythm of its passage might begin to wonder whether a bold man could reach out and take a piece of it for himself. Francis Drake would become that man. But on the Medway, in his boyhood, he was only one of many sons in a crowded household, and the practical question before him was how to earn a living. The answer, as it was for so many boys raised within sight and sound of water, was the sea. He was apprenticed young to the master of a small coasting vessel, a humble trader that worked its way up and down the eastern shores of England and across the narrow sea to the ports of the Low Countries and France, carrying whatever cargo could be had. It was hard unglamorous schooling. The waters there are shallow and treacherous, threaded with sandbanks that shift with every storm, swept by tides that run hard and fogs that close without warning. A young sailor learning his trade in those waters learned to read the sea with great care, to feel the bottom through the motion of the hull, to trust the lead line and the compass and his own gathering instinct. The old master who taught him had no family of his own, and he came in time to look on the diligent young man almost as a son. And when the master died, he left the little ship to Drake. So before he was out of his 20s, Francis Drake owned a vessel and commanded it, and might have lived out an ordinary life of small voyages and small profits, growing slowly older on the coastal trade. If that thought brings you a measure of calm, the slow shipboard life of an ordinary mariner who never sought the wide ocean, then settle into it. And if you find these quiet voyages into history a restful place to let the day fall away, you are warmly invited to follow the channel and travel with us again on another night. Now let us return to the young man with his small ship, because the wider world was about to reach into his quiet trade and pull him out toward the deep. Drake had relations in the western port of Plymouth, among them a prosperous and ambitious family by the name of Hawkins. The Hawkins men were merchants and ship owners of a far grander scale than anything Drake had known, and they were among the first Englishmen to look across the Atlantic and see opportunity in the Spanish New World. The trouble was that the Spanish crown forbade all foreigners from trading in its American colonies. The whole of that vast and wealthy region was meant to be closed, a private market reserved for Spain alone, and any English ship that appeared there was, by the laws of Spain, a trespasser. John Hawkins, the most forceful of the Plymouth family, decided to trade there anyway. He believed that the colonists themselves, hungry for goods their own crown could not supply in sufficient quantity, would welcome English merchants, whatever the official rules might say. And so Hawkins fitted out voyages to cross the ocean and sell his cargo in the Caribbean, sometimes by persuasion and sometimes under the quiet pressure of guns, half trade and half intrusion, always on the edge of the law. It must be told plainly, because the gentle pace of this telling is not meant to hide hard things, that a central part of what Hawkins carried and sold was human beings. He sailed first to the coast of West Africa, where he took people captive or bought them from others who had taken them. And he carried these men, women, and children across the ocean in the holds of his ships to sell them in the Spanish colonies as enslaved labor. This was the beginning of an English involvement in a traffic in human lives that would grow, over the centuries that followed, into one of the great wrongs of history. Francis Drake sailed on these voyages. He was a young captain in the Hawkins enterprise, and he took part in this commerce, and no honest account of his life can pass over it in silence, or pretend that the man who would later be celebrated as a hero began his career in some cleaner trade. He was a man of his time and his nation, and his time and his nation were entering into something terrible, and he was part of it. The sea carries all kinds of cargo, and some of it weighs on the conscience of every generation that comes after. We name it here, quietly and without flinching, and then we follow the thread of the story onward, for the events that turned Drake into the scourge of the Spanish Empire were about to occur, and they would begin with disaster. The year was 1568. Drake sailed in a fleet under the command of John Hawkins, a substantial expedition of several ships that had crossed the Atlantic and traded along the Caribbean coast through a long and largely successful season. As the ships turned at last for home, heavy with the proceeds of their voyage, the weather turned against them. A great storm swept up from the south and scattered the fleet and battered the vessels, and the ships were left leaking, their rigging torn, in no condition to attempt the long passage back across the open ocean. Hawkins needed shelter and the chance to make repairs, and there was only one harbor within reach that could offer it. That harbor was San Juan de Ulua, the port that served the Spanish town of Veracruz on the coast of Mexico, the very gateway through which the treasure of the New World flowed outward to Spain. It was the heart of the empire Hawkins had spent his career quietly defying, and now his storm-beaten ships had no choice but to limp into it and ask for the mercy of repair. When the English ships entered the harbor of San Juan de Ulua, they did so in a delicate and dangerous position. The Spanish garrison there was not strong enough to drive them out by force, and Hawkins, for his part, did not wish to fight. He wished only to repair his vessels and depart. An uneasy arrangement was reached. The English would be permitted to shelter and make their repairs, and in exchange they would behave peaceably and then go on their way. Hostages were exchanged as a guarantee of good faith. For a few days the arrangement held, and the English worked at their battered ships in the relative safety of the anchorage. But the situation changed with the arrival, just outside the harbor, of a powerful Spanish fleet, and aboard that fleet was the newly appointed Viceroy of New Spain, the senior representative of the Spanish crown in all of Mexico. Here was a man of the highest authority confronting the spectacle of foreign intruders, sitting comfortably in one of his own ports. Hawkins faced a terrible decision. He could try to bar the Spanish fleet from entering its own harbor, an act of open war he had no wish and no strength to sustain, or he could allow it in and trust to the agreement that had been made. He chose to trust. The Spanish fleet entered, and for a short while the two forces lay near one another in the crowded anchorage, watchful, uneasy, waiting. The peace did not last. The Viceroy had no intention of honoring an agreement made with men he regarded as trespassers and intruders, and he prepared, quietly and behind the appearance of calm, to fall upon the English and destroy them. When the moment came, it came without warning. Spanish soldiers who had been moved secretly into position attacked, and the guns of the harbor and the fleet opened upon the English ships at close range. What followed was a desperate and confused fight in the enclosed water. Smoke drifting over the anchorage, ships afire, men struggling in the chaos to cut cables and make sail and find some way out of the trap that had closed around them. Most of the English vessels were lost. Hawkins managed to bring his own ship clear, and Drake, commanding a small vessel called the Judith, also won free and out to the open sea. But the bulk of the fleet, the men, the cargo, the proceeds of the whole long voyage, all of it was lost in the harbor of San Juan de Ulua, and many Englishmen were killed or taken prisoner, and those taken prisoner faced a grim fate in the hands of an empire that regarded them as heretics and criminals. The two surviving ships became separated in the confusion and the days that followed, and there would later be hard words about that separation, with some suggesting that Drake had abandoned his commander in the crisis and made off to save himself. Whatever the truth of that quarrel, both ships eventually struggled back across the Atlantic to England, arriving wretched and half-starved, their crews reduced and broken, bearing the news of the catastrophe. For Hawkins, it was a financial blow from which his American ventures never truly recovered. But for Francis Drake, it was something deeper and more lasting than a loss of money. He had trusted in an agreement, and the agreement had been broken, and the breaking of it had cost the lives of men he had sailed with, and very nearly his own. From that day forward, the way Drake looked upon Spain was changed. He came to regard the Spanish crown as faithless and the wealth of its empire as a thing he was entitled to take by any means he could devise. It became, in his mind, less a matter of mere plunder than of settling a debt, a private war waged by one man against the greatest power on earth. And he would pursue it for the rest of his life with a patience and a single-mindedness that nothing seemed to shake. The boy from the River Hulk had found his purpose, and it was a dangerous one. Drake did not rush blindly into vengeance. He was, beneath the boldness that would later make his name, a careful and methodical man, and before he attempted anything ambitious against the Spanish Empire, he set out to learn it. In the years immediately after San Juan de Ulua, he made 1 or 2 quiet voyages back to the Caribbean, voyages of which little is recorded, and the purpose of these voyages seems to have been reconnaissance. He was studying the coast. He was learning where the Spanish settlements lay and how strongly they were held, where the treasure gathered and by what routes it moved, which harbors were watched and which were forgotten. He was learning the winds and the currents and the seasons of that sea. And he was making something that would prove more valuable than any chart, which was friendship with the peoples who had reason of their own to resent Spanish rule. Along the coast of Panama there lived communities of formerly enslaved people who had escaped their captivity and fled into the forests and mountains, where they had built free settlements of their own and maintained a constant, low resistance against the colony that had once held them. The Spanish called them by a name that marked them as runaways. To Drake, they were potential allies, men who knew the country intimately and who shared his enmity towards Spain, and he cultivated their friendship with care. When he was at last ready to attempt something great, it was upon this knowledge and these alliances that his plan would rest. The great attempt came in 1572. Drake fitted out a modest expedition, 2 small ships and a company of fewer than 100 men, and crossed the Atlantic with a plan of remarkable boldness. He meant to capture the town of Nombre de Dios. This town, on the Caribbean shore of Panama, was the place to which the silver of Peru was carried across the isthmus before being loaded aboard the treasure fleets for Spain. At certain seasons, when the fleets were due, the whole annual harvest of a continent's silver might lie gathered in its storehouses, waiting to be shipped. If a bold raider could strike the town at the right moment, the prize would be almost beyond counting. It was an audacious idea, perhaps a reckless one, for the town was defended and Drake's force was small, but he had timed his arrival with care, and he meant to take the place by surprise in the dark hours before dawn. He landed his men quietly, and they moved into the sleeping town, and for a few moments it seemed that the extraordinary plan might actually succeed. It did not succeed, though it came near. The townspeople were roused, and there was confused fighting in the dark and narrow streets, and the defenders, uncertain of how large the attacking force might be, put up enough resistance to slow the raiders. Worse, Drake himself was wounded. He had been struck in the leg and was bleeding heavily. Though in the heat of the action, he said nothing of it and pressed his men forward. They reached the place where the treasure was said to be kept, and there is a story, perhaps true, that they stood within reach of the very storehouse of silver, the prize they had crossed an ocean to seize. But by then the situation had turned against them. Drake's wound had weakened him, and as he faltered, his men saw the blood and understood at last how badly their captain was hurt, and the heart went out of the assault. The light was coming. The defenders were gathering. To linger longer was to lose everything. Drake's followers, refusing to leave their wounded commander behind, carried him back through the streets to the boats, and the expedition withdrew empty-handed, the great prize slipping away in the dawn as they pulled for the safety of the open water. A lesser man might have taken the wound and the failure as a sign to go home, but Drake did not go home. He withdrew to a hidden harbor along the coast, a secret base he had prepared in advance, and there he rested and recovered and waited, and he did not give up his purpose. He understood now that the heavily defended towns were too hard a target for so small a force. But the silver did not stay in the towns. It had to travel. It had to cross the Isthmus of Panama, carried by long trains of pack animals along forest paths from the Pacific side, where it arrived from Peru, to the Caribbean side, where it was shipped for Spain. On those forest paths, far from the guns of any town, the treasure was at its most vulnerable, and it was there, with the help of his allies who knew every track through the jungle, that Drake resolved to strike. He spent long months gathering his strength and his information, and he formed an alliance with the free communities of the forest, and also, in time, with a band of French sailors who had come to those waters with the same intent as his own, and he waited for word that a treasure train was on the move. It was during this long waiting that Francis Drake had an experience that would shape the rest of his life and, in time, the history of the world. His allies among the free people of the forest offered to lead him across the mountainous spine of the isthmus, through the dense green country where few Europeans had ever ventured, to a place from which a remarkable thing could be seen. Drake went with them, traveling for days through the forest, climbing the high ground that divides the two oceans. And at the summit of a ridge there stood a great tree, and into the trunk of that tree steps had been cut, leading up to a kind of platform near the top from which the country fell away on both sides. Drake climbed the tree. From its height he looked back toward the north and east, and there lay the Caribbean Sea, the Atlantic water by which he had come. And then he turned and looked the other way, toward the south and west, and there, shining far off beyond the descending forest, lay another sea entirely. It was the Pacific Ocean, the vast and almost unknown expanse that the Spanish called the South Sea, the ocean upon which Spain sailed without rival or fear, for no enemy ship had ever troubled those waters. Drake stood in the tree and gazed at that distant water, and something settled in him then. It is recorded that he made a solemn promise, a vow spoken aloud, that he would one day sail an English ship upon that sea. It was an almost impossible ambition. No Englishman had ever done such a thing. But Drake was a man who kept his promises to himself, and he carried that vow down from the tree and home across the ocean. And he did not forget it. First, though, there was the matter of the treasure train, and at last the word came that one was on the move. The silver and gold of Peru, having crossed the Pacific arm of its long journey, had been landed and was being carried by a great convoy of pack animals across the isthmus toward the Caribbean coast. Drake and his allies lay in wait along the forest road. The ambush did not go entirely as planned, for the first attempt was spoiled when one of his men, said to have been the worse for drink, broke cover too soon and gave a warning that allowed part of the convoy to be turned back. But Drake was patient and persistent, and he tried again, and the second time he succeeded. His combined force of English sailors, French mariners, and forest allies fell upon a treasure train on the forest road, and this time there was no escape for the convoy. The quantity of silver was so great that the raiders could not possibly carry all of it away. They took what gold they could, for gold is far more valuable for its weight, and the silver they could not transport they buried in the forest or hid as best they could, and some of it they were forced simply to leave behind. Even so, the prize they carried back to the coast and aboard their ships was a fortune. After long months of patience, after the wound and the failure at Nombre de Dios, after fever and hardship, and the deaths of comrades including, in the course of these long campaigns, 2 of Drake's own brothers, who had sailed with him and did not return, the expedition had at last achieved what it came for. Drake sailed home to Plymouth in the late summer of 1573, and his arrival caused a sensation. He had crossed the ocean with a tiny force and returned with a fortune taken directly from the Spanish Empire, and word of his exploit spread quickly. He had become, almost overnight, a famous man. And yet the timing of his return was awkward, for the English crown was at that moment pursuing a careful peace with Spain, and the spectacle of an English captain openly raiding Spanish possessions was an embarrassment to a government that wished to avoid open conflict. For a time, Drake found it prudent to keep out of sight, to let the diplomatic difficulty cool, to be quietly elsewhere while the matter was smoothed over. But the wealth he had brought home was real, and the reputation he had earned was real. And behind the scenes, there were powerful people taking note of this bold and capable man from Devon. People who saw in him an instrument that might one day be turned to great purpose. Among those who came to know of him in time was the Queen of England herself. To understand what happened next, one must understand the strange and tense relationship between England and Spain in those years. The two kingdoms were not openly at war, but they were rivals in almost everything, divided by religion, by trade, by ambition, and by a growing English resentment of the wealth and power that the New World poured into Spanish hands. Queen Elizabeth of England ruled a smaller and poorer realm than the vast empire of Spain, and she ruled it with great cunning and great caution, avoiding open war wherever she could, while quietly encouraging the kind of unofficial pressure that men like Drake could apply. A privateer, a sea captain operating with the Crown's secret blessing but without its open acknowledgement, was a perfect instrument for such a policy. If he succeeded and brought home treasure, the Crown could share in the profit. If he failed or caused a diplomatic crisis, the Crown could disavow him and claim he had acted on his own. It was a careful, deniable, profitable arrangement, and Drake was ideally suited to it, for he combined daring with discretion and had already proven that he could strike the Spanish Empire where it hurt and bring the proceeds home. And so a plan began to take shape, a plan more ambitious than anything Drake had yet attempted, more ambitious perhaps than anything any English sailor had ever attempted. The exact origins of the plan are not entirely clear, for it was the kind of scheme that left few written traces by design, but its essence was this. Drake would lead an expedition not into the Caribbean, where the Spanish were now alert to his methods and the towns were defended against him, but around the bottom of the Americas and up the western coast, into the Pacific, into the South Sea that he had glimpsed from the tree and sworn to sail. There on the ocean that Spain believed entirely safe, where no enemy had ever come, the Spanish carried their treasure in unarmed ships and stored it in undefended ports, never dreaming that any foe could reach them. An English raider appearing on that coast would find the wealth of Peru lying open and unguarded, and might gather it almost at will. It was an extraordinary idea, dangerous in the extreme, for the way into the Pacific lay through the dreaded Strait of Magellan, a passage so difficult and so feared that only a handful of ships had ever made it through. And the way home, should the raiding succeed, might require crossing the entire Pacific and circling the whole world, a feat accomplished by almost no one. But the possible reward was staggering, and the Queen, weighing the risk against the prize and against the deniability the distance afforded her, gave the scheme her quiet approval. She gave it, that is, in the careful manner of her policy. There was no public commission, no open declaration. The voyage was given out to the world, and to most of those who sailed on it, as a trading venture, an expedition bound for distant and respectable purposes. Some investors put money into it, believing it to be one thing, while a smaller circle understood it to be another. The Queen herself, it is said, spoke to Drake privately and made her wishes known, and is supposed to have indicated that she would be glad to be revenged upon the King of Spain for various injuries, words carefully chosen so that they might mean much or little, depending on how events turned out. Drake understood her perfectly. He was being given license to make war upon the Spanish Empire on the far side of the world. With the Crown's secret encouragement and the Crown's plausible denial, and he set about preparing for the greatest voyage of his life. The fleet he assembled was small, as all his fleets were small, for surprise and speed mattered more to him than numbers. At the heart of it was his own ship, a stout vessel of moderate size that he had named, at the outset, the Pelican. She was not large by the standards of the great treasure ships she would one day hunt, but she was well built and well found, sturdy enough for the worst seas in the world, and Drake trusted her. Around her he gathered a handful of smaller vessels, a few more ships of varying size, and a couple of little pinnaces to serve for inshore work and scouting. He provisioned the fleet for an immense and uncertain voyage, taking aboard everything that long absence from any friendly port might require, and he gathered his men, somewhere between 150 and 200 of them, a mixture of hardened sailors and gentlemen adventurers, the latter being men of higher birth who came along for honor and profit, and who did not always sit easily under the command of a man risen from the coasting trade. This mixture of common seamen and proud gentlemen aboard the same crowded ships would, before the voyage was far advanced, give rise to a crisis that nearly tore the expedition apart, and that ended in an event Drake's enemies would never let him forget. The fleet sailed from Plymouth late in the year 1577. An early attempt to depart had been turned back by foul weather almost as soon as it began, forcing the ships to return and refit. And so it was in the closing weeks of the year that the expedition finally cleared the English coast and stood out into the Atlantic. The men aboard, most of them, did not know where they were truly going. They believed, many of them, that they were bound for the warm and ordinary waters of the Mediterranean and the trade of that inland sea. Only Drake and a few of his closest confidants understood the real destination, and Drake kept his counsel close, revealing the truth only gradually as the voyage carried the fleet ever farther from home and ever deeper into commitment. This secrecy was a necessary part of the enterprise, both to preserve surprise against the Spanish and to prevent his investors and the curious from learning too soon what a perilous course he intended. But it also meant that the men were being drawn, step by step, into a venture far more dangerous than the one they had signed for. And as the truth dawned on them, and as the warm waters they had expected gave way to the great swells of the open Atlantic running south, unease began to spread through the ships. The fleet steered first for the south, down past the coast of Africa, calling at islands along the way to take on water and provisions. And where provisions could not be freely had, Drake took them, capturing a Portuguese vessel and pressing its experienced pilot into his service, a man whose knowledge of the southern routes would prove valuable in the strange waters ahead. Then came the long crossing, the great traverse of the Atlantic from the African side to the coast of South America, a passage of many weeks across open water under a changing sky. It was on this crossing that the tensions aboard the fleet, simmering since Plymouth, came at last to a head, and the figure at the center of the trouble was a gentleman named Thomas Doughty. Doughty was a man of education and standing, a courtier of some accomplishment, well-connected and persuasive, and he had come on the voyage as something close to Drake's equal in the early arrangements, a partner in the enterprise rather than a subordinate. But a ship at sea can have only one master, and as the voyage went on, it became clear that Doughty and Drake could not both command, and that the two men had come to distrust and dislike one another deeply. The exact nature of their quarrel has been argued over ever since, for the records that survive were written after the fact by men with reasons to take one side or the other, and the truth lies somewhere beneath layers of accusation. What seems clear is that Doughty, finding himself losing influence, began to undermine Drake's authority, spreading discontent among the gentlemen and the crew, questioning Drake's decisions, and perhaps, as Drake came to believe, working to turn the company against its commander, or even to seize control of part of the fleet for himself. There were charges that Doughty had practiced a kind of dark art, sowing storms and ill fortune by occult means. Charges that say more about the fears of sailors than about any real wrongdoing. but which show how poisoned the atmosphere aboard had become. Whatever the full truth, Drake concluded that Doughty was a danger to the entire expedition, a source of division that, if allowed to continue, would unravel everything, and he resolved to deal with him in the most decisive way. The reckoning came at a harbour on the bleak and windswept coast of what is now southern Argentina, a desolate anchorage called Port San Julian. It was a place already marked by old tragedy, for it was here, more than half a century before, that the explorer Ferdinand Magellan had wintered during his own voyage toward the strait that would bear his name, and here that Magellan had faced a mutiny among his own captains and had put down that mutiny with executions, leaving behind, it was said, a grim marker of his justice. When Drake's fleet came to anchor in that same harbour, the men are said to have found the bleached remains of Magellan's punishment still there upon the shore, a chilling omen for a fleet already torn by its own internal strife. It was in this haunted place that Drake brought Thomas Doughty to trial. He convened a kind of court, assembling the company and laying out the charges against Doughty, accusing him of conspiracy and of attempting to wreck the Voyage and overthrow its commander. The proceeding had the form of a trial, with the men of the company serving as a jury, but it was a trial conducted by a commander who had already decided what the outcome must be, in a remote place, far from any law but Drake's own will. Doughty defended himself, denied the worst of the charges, and demanded at one point that he be taken home to England to be tried by the proper authorities. Drake refused. To carry a prisoner halfway around the world, a focus for every discontent aboard, was to invite the very division he sought to end. The court found Doughty guilty. Drake offered him, it is said, a choice of how he should die, or whether he might be set ashore to take his chances in that empty land. But the only choices were grim ones, and Doughty chose execution by the sword as befitted a gentleman. What followed was strange and solemn, and has troubled observers ever since. On the day appointed, Drake and Doughty are said to have taken communion together, kneeling side by side in the Christian rite, and then to have dined together at the same table, two men sharing a final meal in apparent calm and even courtesy. And then Doughty was led to the block, and he made a composed and dignified end, and the sentence was carried out, and Drake held up the head of the man who had been his partner, and showed it to the assembled company and declared that this was the end of all traitors. It was an act of terrible authority, a demonstration that aboard this fleet there was one master and one only, and that to challenge him was to die. Whether it was justice or something closer to the ruthless removal of a rival. Men have debated for centuries, and the gentle telling of this story cannot resolve what the centuries have not. What is certain is its effect. After Port San Julian, there was no further question of who commanded the expedition. The gentlemen and the sailors alike understood that they were bound to Drake and to his purpose, for good or ill, to the ends of the earth. It was here too that Drake spoke words that have echoed down through the history of the sea, words addressed to the divisions that had nearly destroyed his fleet. He gathered his company and spoke to them of the danger of discord, of the way the proud gentlemen had set themselves above the common sailors, and the sailors had resented the gentlemen, and he declared that this could not continue, that aboard his ships there must be no such division. He said, in words that have come down to us in various forms, that the gentleman must haul and draw with the mariner, and the mariner with the gentleman, that all must labour together as one company, sharing the work and the danger without distinction of rank. It was a remarkable thing to say in an age that held rank to be the order of the world, and it bound the company together in a new way, as a single crew under a single captain for the immense trial that lay just ahead. For now the fleet was poised at the threshold of the Strait of Magellan, the gateway to the Pacific, the passage that Drake had sailed half the world to reach, and that had broken or turned back nearly every ship that had ever attempted it. Before they entered the strait, Drake made a gesture rich with meaning. He renamed his flagship. The vessel that had left Plymouth as the Pelican he now called the Golden Hind, after the emblem on the crest of one of his chief supporters back in England, a powerful patron whose favour mattered greatly to the success of the venture and to Drake's own standing should he return. It was a small thing, the changing of a name, but it marked a turning point, the moment at which the expedition passed out of the known world and into the unknown, and the ship that would carry Drake around the globe took on the name by which history would remember her. The Golden Hind, with her consorts gathered about her, turned toward the dark and narrow opening in the land where two oceans met, and prepared to attempt the passage that lay between the Atlantic she knew and the Pacific she had crossed the world to reach. The Strait of Magellan is one of the most difficult passages in the world, a long, twisting channel that threads between the southern tip of the South American mainland and the broken mountainous islands of Tierra del Fuego, the Land of Fire, so named for the watchfires of its native inhabitants seen burning along the shores. The strait is narrow in places and wide in others, branching into false channels and dead ends that can lure a ship into ruin, hemmed by towering cliffs and snow-clad peaks, swept by sudden and powerful winds that come pouring down off the mountains without warning, and plagued by currents and tides that run hard against the unwary. The weather there is bitter even in the southern summer, and the days, though long at that season, are often lost in cloud and rain and driving sleet. Magellan himself had taken weeks to find his way through, feeling his way into each opening, retreating from each false lead, and most of the few who had attempted the passage in the years since had suffered terribly or failed entirely. Drake brought his fleet to the entrance and, with the methodical care that underlay all his boldness, began to work his way in. He made the passage, in the end, with remarkable speed for that age, threading the strait in a matter of weeks where others had taken months, and the achievement speaks to his seamanship and to the quality of the men and the pilot he had gathered. They worked their way from anchorage to anchorage, feeling their way through the channels, taking on fresh water and gathering what food the harsh land afforded, including great numbers of the strange flightless birds that swarmed on certain islands, penguins which the men salted down by the thousand against the hungry days ahead. They marveled at the country, at the burning watchfires on the shores, at the cold grandeur of the mountains, at the strangeness of having come, by sailing west and south for so long, into a world so utterly unlike the green fields of home. And at last, after the long labour of the strait, the fleet passed out of its western mouth and into the open Pacific, and Drake had fulfilled, in part, the vow he had made in the tree above Panama. An English ship had entered the South Sea, but the ocean that received them was not the calm and welcoming water that its name, the Pacific, seemed to promise. It met them instead with one of the most prolonged and dangerous storms in the recorded history of those seas. No sooner had the fleet cleared the strait than the weather turned against them with a force that nearly destroyed the entire expedition. A great tempest came up from the west and drove the ships back and to the south. Away from the coast, they had meant to follow north toward the treasure of Peru, and the storm did not blow itself out in a day or two as storms usually do. It lasted, in one form or another, for weeks, day after day, week after week. The wind howled, and the seas ran mountainous, and the three remaining ships of the fleet, for by now the smaller vessels had been consumed or sent home, and only 3 of the larger ships remained together, were scattered across the waste of water and lost sight of one another in the murk. It was a time of extremity such as few sailors ever endure. The men laboured at the pumps and the rigging in the cold and the wet, soaked and frozen and exhausted, while the great seas lifted the ships and dropped them and threatened with every wave to overwhelm them entirely. In the chaos of that endless storm, the fleet came apart. One of the three ships, a vessel called the Marigold, was lost with all her company. She vanished in the night in the height of the tempest, and it was said that some aboard the other ships heard, through the roar of the wind, the cries of her men as she went down, a sound that haunted the survivors ever after. No trace of her was ever found. She simply went into the sea with all her people and was gone, one of the countless ships that the ocean has taken without explanation or mercy, leaving only the memory of those cries carried on the wind. The second ship, called the Elizabeth, became separated from Drake's Golden Hind, and her captain, finding himself alone and battered and despairing of the whole enterprise, made the difficult decision to turn back. He worked his ship back into the shelter of the strait, and eventually, after a hard and lonely passage, brought her home to England, abandoning the voyage and Drake along with it. Whether this was prudence or a failure of nerve was argued over afterward. But the practical result was that the Elizabeth and her men took no further part in the great adventure, and Drake, in his Golden Hind, was left utterly alone, a single ship driven far to the south, with no consort, no support, and no certainty that he would ever see his other vessels or his homeland again. And yet from this extremity came a discovery of real importance. The storm had driven the Golden Hind so far to the south, below the very tip of the continent, that Drake found himself in open water where the geographers of the age had believed there was land. It had been thought that Tierra del Fuego was the northern edge of a great southern continent that stretched away toward the bottom of the world, and that the Strait of Magellan was the only passage between the two oceans, a narrow gate between two great land masses. But Drake, driven south by the tempest, found no such southern continent. He found instead open sea, the place where the Atlantic and the Pacific meet and mingle below the last of the land, a broad and stormy gateway between the oceans. It was a discovery that would, in time, redraw the maps of the world and open a new route between the seas that would one day bear his name. In the moment, half drowned and alone in the screaming dark, Drake can have taken little comfort from his contribution to geography. But he had learned something that few before him knew, that the land ended, that there was sea all the way around, and the knowledge would matter. At last, after weeks that must have seemed without end, the great storm blew itself out, and the Golden Hind found herself alone upon a calming sea, far to the south of where she had meant to be. Battered but afloat, her company reduced and exhausted, but alive. Drake took stock of his situation. He had lost the Marigold and all her men to the sea. He had lost the Elizabeth to the long road home. He had only one ship now, his own, and somewhere fewer than 100 men. He was on the wrong side of the world from any friend, in an ocean ruled entirely by his enemy, with no possibility of reinforcement or rescue, and only the most desperate prospect of ever getting home. By any reasonable measure, the expedition was already a catastrophe, its fleet destroyed, its purpose seemingly beyond reach. A cautious man would have turned for home as the captain of the Elizabeth had done, grateful to escape with his life. But Drake was not a cautious man, or rather, his caution served his boldness rather than restraining it. He looked at his single ship and his diminished crew, and the vast, hostile ocean before him, and he saw not catastrophe, but opportunity. He was alone, yes, but being alone meant he was unencumbered, swift, and above all, unexpected. The entire Pacific coast of Spanish America lay before him to the north. Hundreds and hundreds of leagues of undefended shore, dotted with ports that had never in their history seen an enemy ship, sailed by treasure vessels that carried no guns because there had never been anyone to fight. No warning could possibly have reached those waters that an English raider was loose upon the South Sea, for no English raider had ever been there, and the very idea was beyond the imagining of the Spanish settlers who lived in the comfortable certainty of their isolation. Drake had, in his single battered ship, the most precious advantage in all of warfare, which is complete surprise, and he meant to use it to the full. He turned the Golden Hind north, and he began to sail up the long defenseless coast toward the silver of Peru. And what followed was a campaign of raiding so audacious and so successful that its like had never been seen. The first taste of what awaited him came at a place on the coast of Chile, a small harbor where the Golden Hind arrived to find a Spanish ship lying quietly at anchor, her crew utterly unsuspecting. The Spaniards aboard saw a ship approaching and assumed, naturally, that she must be a friend. For what else could she be on that sea? And they made ready to welcome her, even, it is said, preparing wine to greet the newcomers in the easy hospitality of men who had never known fear upon their own ocean. They learned their error only when Drake's men came aboard. The ship was taken without a fight, and she proved to be carrying a quantity of wine and a good deal of gold. And the people of the little port, seeing what had happened, fled inland in alarm. Drake helped himself to what the town and the ship could offer and sailed on, and the pattern of the whole campaign was established in that first easy capture. Up and down the coast it would be the same. The Spanish, having no conception that an enemy could possibly be among them, offered no resistance until it was too late, and Drake moved among their ports and their shipping like a man walking through an unlocked house while its occupants slept. He worked his way northward along the coast, and everywhere the story repeated itself with small variations. At one anchorage he found ships and took from them what they carried. At another he sent his men ashore to gather provisions and whatever valuables could be found. He was careful, for the most part, in how he conducted these raids, for Drake was not a man who took lives needlessly, and there was little need. The surprise was so complete and the resistance so slight that force was rarely required. He took treasure, he took provisions, he took information, questioning the people he captured about what lay ahead, about which ships were on the coast and what they carried and where the great prizes might be found. And then he released most of his prisoners and sailed on. The Spanish authorities, as word of his presence slowly spread up the coast ahead of him, were thrown into confusion and alarm. An enemy ship on the South Sea was a thing without precedent, a violation of the natural order as they understood it, and they scrambled to organize some response, to warn the ports ahead, to gather forces, to send word overland to the great city of Lima and to the viceroy who ruled Peru. But word traveled slowly along that long coast, and Drake's ship traveled fast, and again he arrived at a port before the warning of his coming and found the people unprepared. There is a story from this part of the voyage that has often been told, because it captures so perfectly the strange, dreamlike quality of Drake's progress up that sleeping coast. At one place his men came ashore and found a Spaniard lying asleep on the ground beside the path, and near him, glinting in the sun, lay bars of silver, a small fortune that the man had been transporting and had set down to rest. Drake's sailors gathered up the silver and went on their way, leaving the man to his slumber, and he woke, presumably, to find his treasure gone and no explanation but the impossible one that English raiders had walked up out of the South Sea and taken it. Whether the tale is exactly true or has grown in the telling, it expresses a real truth about that campaign, which is that Drake had achieved such total surprise that the wealth of an empire lay about almost as if for the taking, unguarded, unsuspecting, undefended, and he gathered it as a man might gather windfall fruit. At another place, his men encountered a long train of pack animals laden with silver, the same kind of treasure convoy he had ambushed years before in Panama. And here on the Pacific side, they took it with the same ease, leading away a fortune in metal, while the country lay astonished behind them. The accumulating treasure was already, by this point in the voyage, a great fortune, more than enough to make the expedition a success many times over, and to enrich Drake and his investors beyond their hopes. But Drake had heard, in his questioning of captured Spaniards, of a far greater prize, a single ship that was said to be carrying the gathered treasure of a whole season, the richest vessel on all the South Sea. The Spanish called her, formerly, by the name of a saint, but among the sailors she had earned a rougher nickname, a coarse and irreverent name that meant something like the Great Spitter or the Spitfire, on account of her guns, though in truth she carried little to defend herself with on that supposedly safe ocean. This ship had sailed from the port of Callao, which served the great city of Lima, bound north toward Panama, carrying a cargo of silver and gold of almost unimaginable value. And she had a head start, for she had left before Drake reached those waters. If Drake could overtake her before she reached the safety of port, before any warning could reach her, he would take the greatest single prize ever seized from the Spanish Empire. He set the Golden Hind in pursuit, and the chase that followed was the heart of the whole adventure, the moment toward which everything had been building since he climbed the tree above Panama and looked out at the sea he had sworn to sail. The pursuit was a long one, for the treasure ship had a substantial lead, and the Pacific is vast, and Drake drove his ship hard up the coast, gathering news of his quarry from every vessel he met. He learned that he was gaining, that the great ship was somewhere ahead, that she was still unaware of any danger. To encourage his lookouts, Drake is said to have promised a reward, a fine gold chain, to the first man who sighted the prize. And the crew watched the horizon with the keen attention of men who knew that a fortune sailed somewhere just over the curve of the sea. Day after day the chase went on, the Golden Hind crowding on every sail her masts could bear, eating into the lead of the unsuspecting treasure ship. And at last, late in the day, a lookout high on the mast caught sight of a distant sail, and the cry went up. And there she was, the great ship, the prize of prizes, sailing along in the golden light of the afternoon in perfect ignorance of the ship that was bearing down upon her out of the south. Drake was too clever to rush upon her openly and frighten her into flight or resistance, while there was still daylight and distance enough for her to attempt either. Instead, he resorted to a ruse. He slowed his own ship, trailing lines and casks over the side to drag in the water and check his speed, so that the Golden Hind seemed to wallow along like a slow and heavily laden merchantman rather than a swift raider. And in this guise he allowed the treasure ship to believe that the vessel approaching from astern was merely another Spanish trader making the same passage north. The captain of the treasure ship, seeing no cause for alarm, even shortened his own sail, it is said, to let the supposed friend come up and keep him company through the night, an act of courtesy that sealed his fate. As darkness fell and the two ships drew close together, Drake cast off his drags and let the Golden Hind leap forward, and his men hailed the great ship and called upon her to surrender. The Spanish captain, astonished, refused, perhaps not even believing what was happening, and Drake's guns spoke, firing to disable rather than to destroy, bringing down a mast and sweeping the deck, and his men swarmed aboard. The fight, such as it was brief, for the treasure ship carried little with which to defend herself, and in a short time she was taken. The richest ship on the South Sea was in Drake's hands. What Drake found in the holds of the captured treasure ship surpassed even his hopes. The cargo was so vast that it took his men several days simply to transfer it from the one ship to the other, the Golden Hind lying alongside her prize on the open ocean, while boat after boat carried the wealth across. There were great quantities of silver, bars and coins by the ton, and chests of gold, and pearls, and precious objects of every kind. The gathered output of the mines of Peru for a whole season, the lifeblood of the empire diverted in a single afternoon into the hold of a single English ship. The exact value has been reckoned in different ways by different historians, but by any measure, it was an enormous fortune, one of the greatest hauls ever taken by any sea raider in the history of the world. Enough to make every man aboard the Golden Hind wealthy, and to return to the Queen and the investors a profit that would be remembered for generations. The little ship rode lower and lower in the water as the treasure came aboard, until she was laden almost to her limits with the wealth of the Spanish Indies. Drake's conduct toward the people of the captured ship, as toward most of those he took on that coast, was marked by a kind of courtesy that surprised his prisoners and has been remarked upon ever since. He did not treat them with cruelty. He took their cargo, which was, after all, the entire point of his presence on that sea, but he treated the men themselves, and especially the officers and gentlemen among them, with consideration, dining with them, conversing with them, showing them over his ship, and sending them on their way with gifts and with letters of safe conduct that might protect them, and even, in some accounts, with small payments in recompense for particular losses. He was conducting, in his own mind, a war, not a campaign of mere robbery, and he wished it understood that he made war upon the King of Spain and the wealth of his empire, not upon the ordinary people of that empire, whom he treated, when they did not resist him, almost as guests aboard his ship. The Spanish who encountered him carried home strange reports of this raider, who plundered them and then entertained them, who took their silver and returned their personal valuables, who was at once the most feared enemy on their sea, and a man of unexpected grace. It was good policy, for it discouraged desperate resistance and earned him a measure of respect even among his victims. But it also seems to have reflected something real in Drake's character, a sense of himself as a man of honor waging a legitimate war rather than a common thief. With the great treasure aboard, Drake faced the question that had hung over the whole enterprise from the beginning. He had achieved what he came for, and more. He was now immensely rich, his ship laden with a fortune. But he was on the far side of the world, in an ocean ruled by his enemy, who by now was thoroughly roused against him. The Viceroy of Peru, learning of the loss of the treasure ship and of the English raider loose upon his coast, had at last organized a response and sent ships in pursuit, though they were always too slow and too late to catch the swift and now richly laden Golden Hind. Behind Drake, to the south, lay the long coast he had already plundered, now alert and angry, and beyond it the terrible strait and the stormy seas that had nearly destroyed him on the way out. To return the way he had come, back through the Strait of Magellan past a coast that now knew him and lay in wait for him, was to court disaster. Drake needed another way home, and the search for that way home would carry him into waters no English ship had ever sailed, and around a course that would, when it was complete, make him only the second commander in history to lead an expedition around the entire world, and the first to survive the whole voyage in command of his own ship from beginning to end. There were, in theory, several ways home from the Pacific, none of them good. He might go back through the strait, which he had reason to dread. He might search to the north for the long-rumored passage that geographers believed must exist along the top of the Americas, a northern strait that would lead from the Pacific back into the Atlantic, and so home by a short and secret road, the passage that explorers would seek in vain for centuries, and that does not, in any practical form, exist. Or he might do the most daring thing of all and strike out west across the whole breadth of the Pacific, the greatest ocean on Earth, and come home the long way around, past the Spice Islands of the east, across the Indian Ocean, around the southern Cape of Africa, and so up the length of the Atlantic to England, completing a circle around the entire globe. Drake seems to have considered the northern passage first, for it promised the shortest road home and the chance to discover something of great value, and he sailed far up the western coast of North America in search of it, farther north than any European had charted those shores. He sailed up past the lands that would one day be Mexico and California, and beyond, into colder and colder waters, and he found no passage, only an endless coast trending ever northward, and weather that grew harsh and forbidding as he went, with cold fogs and contrary winds that wearied his men, who had grown used to the warmth of the tropics and suffered in the chill. At last, finding no strait and unwilling to drive his men and his treasure-laden ship into the icy unknown, he turned back south to a more hospitable latitude and brought the Golden Hind to anchor in a sheltered bay on the coast of what is now California, where he might rest his crew, repair his ship, and prepare for whatever course he chose. The exact location of this bay has been argued over by historians for a very long time, with various harbours along that coast, each having their advocates. But wherever it was, the time Drake spent there was significant, both for his men and for the larger story of his nation's reach into the world. The ship was in real need of attention after so long a voyage, her hull foul with the growth of warm seas, perhaps leaking, in want of the careening and repair that no friendly port could provide on all that hostile ocean. Drake's men ran her aground gently on the shore of the bay, or hauled her over in the shallows, and set about cleaning and mending her, scraping the growth from her bottom, caulking her seams, setting to rights all the wear of the long months at sea. While this work went on, the English had their first sustained contact with the native people of that coast, and the meetings were, by the accounts that survive, peaceable and even warm, marked on the part of the local people by a curiosity and ceremony that the English interpreted, perhaps mistakenly, as a kind of welcome and even reverence. There were gifts exchanged and ceremonies performed, and the English came to believe, rightly or wrongly, that the people of that land had offered Drake some form of acknowledgement as a great chief or lord. Whatever the true meaning of these encounters, which were shaped by deep misunderstanding on both sides, as such first meetings nearly always were, Drake took the opportunity to make a claim on behalf of his queen. He named the land Nova Albion, New Albion, an old poetic name for England, and he set up some marker of England's claim to that distant shore, a plate or post recording that the country had been taken into the possession of the English crown. It was a claim that would have little immediate effect, for England had no power to settle or hold so remote a coast for generations to come. But it was an early reaching of English ambition toward the western edge of North America, a small seed planted by a raider resting his ship on his way around the world. When the Golden Hind was clean and sound again, and the men were rested, Drake made his decision. He would not go back the way he had come. He would sail west, across the whole vast breadth of the Pacific, and come home around the world. It was a tremendous gamble, for the Pacific is the largest ocean on Earth, far larger than the Atlantic, and to cross it meant committing to weeks upon weeks of open water sailing far from any known land, trusting to his provisions and his navigation and his fortune to carry him to the islands of the Far East, where the Spanish and Portuguese had their spice trade. But it was, on balance, the safest of his dangerous choices, for it led away from the roused and waiting Spanish and into waters where his enemies did not expect him, and it offered the prospect of a triumphant homecoming by a route almost no one had travelled. And so the Golden Hind turned her bow toward the setting sun and sailed out into the emptiness of the Pacific, and the coast of America sank away behind her. And for many weeks there was nothing but the ship and the sea and the sky and the slow turning of the days. The crossing was long, far longer than the Atlantic passage, and it tested the endurance of the men and the soundness of the ship. For something like 2 months they sailed across open water without sight of any significant land. The same blue circle of ocean around them day after day, the same routines of watch and work and rest, the same careful husbanding of food and water that grew more precious as the weeks wore on. The Pacific, on this crossing, lived up to its peaceful name, granting them, for the most part, steady winds and fair weather, which was a mercy, for the ship was deeply laden with treasure, and a great storm in mid-ocean might have ended everything. Drake navigated by the sun and the stars and his own gathered skill, holding his course towards the west and a little south, aiming for the islands that he knew lay scattered across the western Pacific, and his navigation held true, and at last, after the long emptiness, land appeared. The islands of the far west and the Golden Hind passed among them, taking on fresh water and food, and meeting peoples who had never seen Europeans of any kind, let alone Englishmen come from beyond the edge of the known world. Drake made his way, in time, to the Moluccas, the famous Spice Islands, the small but immensely valuable islands that were the source of the cloves and nutmeg and other spices that Europe prized above almost any other commodity. These islands were the object of fierce competition among the European powers, and especially of the Portuguese, who had established themselves in the eastern trade and guarded it jealously. Drake came to the island of Ternate, where there ruled a powerful sultan who was at that time in conflict with the Portuguese, and who therefore looked upon the arrival of another European power, the English, with interest as a possible ally and trading partner against his rivals. The meeting between Drake and the Sultan of Ternate was conducted with great ceremony, the Sultan coming out to the Golden Hind in state, with music and a great retinue and all the splendor of his court, and Drake receiving him with such honor as his ship could provide. An arrangement was reached, and Drake was permitted to buy a quantity of cloves, loading his ship with the precious spice to add to the treasure she already carried, so that the Golden Hind now bore not only the silver and gold of America, but the spices of the East, a cargo of double richness gathered from opposite ends of the earth. This contact with Ternate also had a meaning beyond the immediate trade, for it marked an early step in England's reaching toward the commerce of the eastern seas, a reaching that would grow, over the centuries that followed, into a vast and consequential involvement in that part of the world. His ship now heavy with spice as well as treasure, Drake set sail again, threading his way among the islands and reefs of those eastern seas, waters that were largely unknown to him and poorly charted, scattered with hidden dangers. And it was here, when he had come through so much, survived the strait and the great storm and the long Pacific crossing, and gathered the wealth of two worlds into his hold, that the voyage came nearer to total destruction than at any other moment in its whole long course. The Golden Hind, sailing at night among the islands off the coast of a great island in those eastern seas, ran hard aground upon a reef. The ship struck the rock and stuck fast, held by the coral, leaning over, with the deep sea on one side and the unyielding reef beneath her. And there she lay, fixed and helpless, far from any aid, with all the wealth of the voyage aboard and no apparent way to free her. It was a moment of the gravest peril, and it is worth pausing upon, for it shows how close the whole triumphant story came to ending in quiet disaster on an unnamed reef on the far side of the world. The ship was held fast and could not be moved. If the weather turned, if a swell came up, the seas would lift her and grind her upon the coral and break her apart, and the treasure and the men and the whole achievement of the voyage would go to the bottom together, and the world would never have known what had become of Drake, who would simply have vanished into the eastern seas as the Marigold had vanished into the southern storm. One more ship lost without explanation. The men, by all accounts, gave themselves up at first for lost. And here Drake, who was a man of genuine and deep religious conviction, whatever else he was, called his company together, and they prayed, and they took the Christian communion together there upon the stranded ship, commending themselves to God in what many of them believed might be their final hours. It was the same rite he had shared with Thomas Doughty before the execution at Port San Julian. The solemn sacrament invoked now in a very different extremity, and it speaks to the deep current of faith that ran beneath the boldness and the cunning and the long campaign of plunder, a faith that Drake seems genuinely to have held, and that sustained him and his men in their darkest hour. Then they set about trying to save themselves, to lighten the ship, and so, they hoped, to lift her off the reef. They began to throw cargo overboard. They cast into the sea some of their provisions and some of their guns. The heavy cannon heaved over the side into the deep, and even, painfully, a quantity of the precious spice they had bought at Ternate, the cloves thrown into the water to lighten the load that pinned them to the rock. It must have been a bitter thing to cast away the very wealth they had come so far to gather, but the treasure was worth nothing to dead men, and the ship had to be lightened, or all would be lost. And yet, even with this sacrifice, the ship would not come free, held fast as she was upon the reef, and it began to seem that nothing would save them. What freed them in the end was not their labor, but a change in the wind and the water. The Golden Hind had grounded, it seems, when the wind held her pressed against the reef, and when at last the wind shifted, the pressure that pinned her was released, and the ship, lightened and no longer held, slid suddenly off the coral and into deep water, floating free, sound and whole, delivered as if by a miracle from a position that had seemed entirely without hope. The men who had given themselves up for lost found themselves alive and afloat with their ship beneath them and the open sea before them, and they must have felt that some hand beyond their own had reached down and lifted them off the rock. After so narrow an escape, Drake handled his ship with the greatest care through the remaining dangers of those island seas, feeling his way among the reefs and shoals until he won clear into more open water. There remained before him the long passage across the Indian Ocean and around the southern tip of Africa, a route that the Portuguese had pioneered and largely controlled. And Drake had to make this passage warily, for he had no wish to be caught and overwhelmed by a Portuguese squadron when he had come so close to bringing his prize home. He sailed across the wide Indian Ocean, another great stretch of open water, and came at last to the southern Cape of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, the stormy headland that guards the passage between the Indian and Atlantic Oceans, and that had wrecked or turned back many a ship before him. The Cape, which had a fearsome reputation among sailors, treated Drake more gently than its name and history might have promised, and he rounded it without disaster, passing from the Indian Ocean into the Atlantic, into waters that led, at long last, toward home. The worst was behind him now. He had only to sail up the length of the Atlantic, past the bulge of Africa and the islands he had visited on the outward voyage nearly 3 years before, and so to England. The long passage north up the Atlantic was made with the same care that had carried him through every other stage of the voyage, husbanding his dwindling provisions, avoiding contact that might bring danger, nursing his treasure-laden ship toward home. The men aboard, the survivors of all those who had sailed from Plymouth, must have felt with each passing day the strange weight of what they had done, and the growing nearness of a home most of them had surely despaired of ever seeing again. They had been gone the better part of 3 years. They had sailed around the entire world, a thing almost no one had ever done. They had survived storms and reefs and the hostility of the greatest empire on earth, and they carried in their hold a fortune beyond the dreams of ordinary men. And they did not even know, as they sailed north, what they would find when they reached England. Whether the Queen who had sent them out still reigned, whether the delicate peace with Spain still held or had given way to open war, whether they would come home to triumph or to a realm that had changed beyond recognition in their long absence. There was no way to know until they arrived. So they sailed on, north and north, and the water warmed and then cooled again, and the familiar latitudes of home drew near. And at last, in the autumn of the year 1580, the coast of England rose out of the sea before them, and the Golden Hind, alone of all the fleet that had set out, came home. There is a story told of Drake's arrival at Plymouth that captures the uncertainty of that homecoming with perfect economy. As the Golden Hind came into the harbour, Drake is said to have hailed some fishermen or others on the water and called out to them a single anxious question. He asked whether the Queen was alive and well. It was the question on which everything depended. If Elizabeth still lived and reigned, then Drake came home a hero, the bearer of a great triumph and a greater fortune, secure in the favour of the sovereign who had secretly blessed his voyage. But if she had died in his absence, if the throne had passed to some other hand, perhaps to one friendlier to Spain, then Drake came home not as a hero but as a pirate, a man who had committed acts of war against a power with which his country might now be at peace, a man whose treasure might be seized and whose neck might be in danger. Everything turned on the answer to that one question, and one can imagine the weight with which Drake awaited it, after all the leagues and all the years. The answer came back across the water. The Queen lived. She was alive and well and still upon her throne. And so Drake had come home, against every probability, into safety and into glory, and the most extraordinary voyage of his age was at an end. But the matter was not so simple as a hero's welcome, for Drake's return placed the Queen and her government in a position of great difficulty. The fact was that England and Spain were not at war. The voyage had been undertaken in secret, precisely so that it might be disavowed if necessary. And now here was Drake, returned with a vast treasure taken openly from the Spanish Empire. Treasure that the Spanish ambassador in England immediately and loudly demanded be returned, denouncing Drake as a pirate and his queen as the protector of pirates, and threatening grave consequences if restitution were not made. The Queen had to weigh competing considerations of the greatest delicacy. To return the treasure and punish Drake would satisfy Spain and preserve the peace, but it would mean giving up an enormous fortune that her realm sorely needed, and abandoning a man who had served her boldly and well, and it would humiliate England before its great rival. To keep the treasure and honour Drake would enrich the crown and gratify English pride and send a message of defiance to Spain. But it would bring England a long step closer to the open war that Elizabeth had laboured so carefully to avoid. It was a decision that touched the whole future course of relations between the two powers, and the Queen took her time over it, keeping Drake and his treasure close while she calculated the balance of risk and reward. In the end, she chose Drake, and she chose the treasure, and she chose to do so in the most public and provocative manner imaginable. The treasure was brought ashore and the great bulk of it taken into the Queen's keeping, becoming, by various reckonings, a sum so large that it transformed the finances of the English crown, an injection of wealth that some have argued helped to lay the foundations of England's later rise as a power of the seas. Drake and his investors were rewarded handsomely, their fortunes made many times over, and the men who had sailed with him shared in a prosperity beyond anything their station could ordinarily have hoped for. And then the Queen did a thing that announced her decision to the whole world. She went down to the Golden Hind herself, the little ship that had carried Drake around the globe, now lying at a berth on the river near London, and there, aboard the very vessel that had plundered the Spanish Empire, in a great public ceremony attended by the court and witnessed by the representatives of foreign powers, she had Francis Drake knighted. He knelt on the deck of his own ship, the boy from the River Hulk, the raider of the South Sea, and rose Sir Francis Drake, a knight of the realm, honoured by his sovereign for the very acts that the King of Spain denounced as the work of a common criminal. It was an extraordinary gesture, calculated and deliberate, and its meaning was unmistakable. By knighting Drake aboard the Golden Hind, the Queen of England declared to the world that she stood behind what he had done, that the wealth of the Indies was fair prize, that England would not be cowed by Spanish power or Spanish complaints, and that the long, careful, deniable contest between the two realms had taken a new and more open turn. The peace between England and Spain still held, formally for some years yet, but the knighting of Drake was a marker on the road toward the war that would eventually come, a declaration of defiance dressed in the forms of ceremony. And for Drake himself, it was the summit of his rise, the moment at which the obscure mariner became one of the most celebrated men in the kingdom, his name known throughout England and feared throughout the Spanish world. The man who had sailed around the earth and robbed the wealthiest empire on the globe, and come home to be honored by his queen upon the deck of the ship that had carried him through it all. The Golden Hind herself, the worn little ship that had done so much, was given a place of honor. She was set up on the riverbank near London and preserved as a monument to the voyage, a thing for people to come and see and marvel at. And for many years she remained there, a relic of the great circumnavigation, slowly decaying in the open air as visitors walked her decks and wondered at the smallness of the vessel that had carried Drake around the world. In time, the timbers rotted and the ship fell to pieces and was broken up, and a chair made from some of her surviving wood was preserved and given to a great university, where it remains, a fragment of the famous ship, a quiet relic of the voyage that had once been the talk of all Europe. But for now, in the years after his return, the Golden Hind stood whole on her riverbank, and Drake stood at the height of his fame, a rich man and a knight, settling into the life of a great gentleman of his country. He bought a fine estate, an old abbey in his native Devon, and he took a part in the public life of the realm, serving in Parliament and as the Mayor of Plymouth. And he might, had the world been quieter, have lived out his remaining years in honoured ease as a country gentleman who had once done a remarkable thing. But the world was not quiet, and the contest between England and Spain that Drake had done so much to inflame was moving steadily toward open war. Through the years that followed his return, relations between the two powers worsened. The religious division between Protestant England and the great Catholic Empire grew sharper, and England gave aid to the Protestant rebels in the Low Countries who were fighting against Spanish rule there, and Spain in turn lent support to plots and discontents against Elizabeth. And the long cold rivalry grew colder and harder until war became less a danger to be avoided than a certainty to be prepared for. And as war approached, the English crown turned again to the man who had proven himself its most effective instrument against Spain. And Drake was sent once more across the ocean, this time not as a deniable privateer slipping secretly into forbidden seas, but at the head of a substantial fleet with the crown's open backing to make war directly upon the Spanish Empire in the Caribbean. This expedition, which sailed in the middle of the 1580s, was a different thing from the lone voyage of the Golden Hind. It was a fleet of more than 20 ships carrying thousands of men, a force capable of attacking and holding the great fortified towns that had been too strong for Drake's small companies in his earlier raids. He crossed the Atlantic and fell upon the Spanish Caribbean with this powerful force, and he took and held, for a time, some of the most important cities of the Spanish New World. He captured Santo Domingo, the oldest and one of the most prominent Spanish settlements in the Americas, the very seat of Spanish power in the islands, and he held it and extracted a ransom for its return. He captured Cartagena, a great and wealthy port on the mainland, and held it likewise and took a ransom for it. These were not the quiet raids of his earlier career, but open acts of war, blows struck directly at the prestige and the pocket of the Spanish crown, demonstrations that the empire which had seemed so invulnerable could be reached and humbled in its own heartland by English arms. The expedition was costly, for disease ran through Drake's crowded ships, and carried off many of his men, a reminder that the deadliest enemy in those tropical campaigns was very often not the Spanish, but the fevers of the climate, against which the medicine of the age had no defense. But the blow to Spanish prestige was real and was felt throughout Europe, and it convinced the King of Spain, more than anything else perhaps, that the English problem could no longer be managed by patience and diplomacy, and that England would have to be dealt with by force, by a great invasion that would end the reign of Elizabeth and bring her troublesome realm to heel. So the King of Spain began to assemble the means of that invasion. A vast fleet, the Great Armada, an enormous gathering of ships and men intended to sail to England, to clear the way for an army to cross from the Low Countries and to conquer the island realm that had so long defied and plundered him. The preparation of so great a fleet could not be hidden, and word of it reached England, and the English crown understood that the long-deferred reckoning was at hand. And once again, the man to whom England turned to strike at this gathering danger was Sir Francis Drake. He was given command of a fleet and sent to do what he did best, to carry the war to the enemy's own coast, to disrupt and delay and damage the great preparations before they could be completed and turned against England. What he did then became one of the most celebrated exploits of his celebrated career, an action remembered ever after by a phrase of wonderful boldness, the singeing of the King of Spain's beard. Drake sailed his fleet directly to the coast of Spain, to the great harbour of Cadiz, one of the principal ports where the Armada was being assembled and supplied. He sailed boldly into the harbour itself, in among the gathered shipping, and there he fell upon the vessels and stores that were being readied for the invasion of his country. For the better part of 2 days, he ranged through the harbour, capturing and burning ships, destroying supplies, wrecking the careful preparations of the enemy in his own home port. And then he sailed out again, having done great damage and suffered little, leaving the harbour of Cadiz in confusion behind him. It was an act of astonishing audacity to sail into the enemy's own harbour and burn his fleet at its moorings, and it delighted England and humiliated Spain, and it delayed the sailing of the Armada by a considerable time that England used to prepare its own defences. Drake himself is supposed to have described the exploit, with characteristic wit, as the singeing of the King of Spain's beard, a phrase that captured both the boldness of the deed and the cool nerve with which it was done, a small insolence offered to the most powerful monarch in the world. A singeing of his beard by a sea captain from Devon who had been robbing him for the better part of 20 years. The singeing of the beard delayed the Armada, but could not prevent it, and in time the great fleet was ready, and it sailed. And there came at last the moment toward which the whole long rivalry had been building, the moment when the might of Spain came north to conquer England. The Armada was a tremendous force, a vast fleet of large ships carrying a great army, intended to sweep up the Channel, join with the Spanish forces in the Low Countries, and ferry an invading army across to English soil. Against it, England gathered every ship it could muster, a fleet of vessels generally smaller and more nimble than the great Spanish ships, commanded by a Lord Admiral of high rank, with Drake serving as one of his chief subordinates, a Vice Admiral, the most famous fighting sailor in the realm, lending his name and his skill to the defense of his country in its hour of greatest danger. The summer of the year 1588 brought the two fleets together in the waters of the English Channel, and there was fought one of the decisive campaigns in the history of England, a running series of engagements up the Channel as the English ships harried the great Spanish formation, never quite able to break it, but never letting it rest, snapping at its edges, taking what stragglers they could, denying it the secure anchorage and the calm sea it needed to carry out its purpose. There is a famous story attached to Drake and the coming of the Armada, one of those tales that may be more legend than fact, but that has become inseparable from his memory. It is said that as the Spanish fleet was first sighted approaching, Drake was ashore at Plymouth, engaged in a game of bowls upon the green, and that, when the news was brought to him that the enemy was in sight, he calmly declined to be hurried, remarking that there was time enough both to finish the game and to beat the Spaniards afterward, and that only when his game was done did he go down to his ship and put to sea. Whether he ever truly said such a thing, no one can be certain, for the story was not written down until long afterward, but it has been cherished for centuries as a perfect expression of the coolness and confidence that Drake embodied. The unhurried calm of a man who had faced the worst the sea and the Spanish Empire could offer, and who met even the Great Armada with the composure of a man finishing a game on a summer evening. True or not, it belongs to him now, a part of the legend that gathered around his name. In the fighting itself, Drake played a leading and not uncontroversial part. During the running battle up the Channel, he was given charge of leading part of the English fleet through the night by the light of a lantern at his stern, so that the other ships might follow him and keep formation in the dark. But in the night, Drake's lantern was seen to go out, and the fleet was thrown into some confusion, and it emerged afterward that Drake had broken off in the darkness to pursue and capture a damaged Spanish ship, a great vessel called the Rosario that had been disabled in a collision and left behind by her fleet. Drake took her, a rich prize carrying treasure and important Spanish officers, and his critics afterward accused him of having abandoned his duty of leading the fleet in order to enrich himself with a captured ship, of letting private gain pull him from the larger purpose at a critical moment. Drake had his defenders and his explanations, and the matter was much disputed, and it remains one of the shadows on his conduct in that campaign. A reminder that the same boldness and appetite for prizes that made him so effective a raider could, in the discipline of a fleet action, become a kind of liability. But the capture of the Rosario was, in itself, a real blow to the enemy, and the larger campaign went on. The decisive moment of the whole campaign came when the Spanish fleet, having reached the narrow seas off the coast of the Low Countries, came to anchor to await the army it was meant to escort across to England. The English saw their opportunity in the crowded Spanish anchorage. On a dark night, they prepared a number of their own ships, filling them with anything that would burn, setting them alight, and sending them drifting down upon the anchored Spanish fleet, on the wind and the tide, blazing in the darkness. Vessels of fire steered straight into the heart of the enemy formation. The sight of these burning ships bearing down upon them in the night threw the Spanish into alarm, for a fire among their crowded and tightly anchored ships could spread from vessel to vessel and consume the whole fleet. And rather than risk that ruin, many of the Spanish captains cut their anchor cables and stood out hastily to sea to escape the flames, scattering their careful formation in the darkness and the confusion. The fireships did little direct damage, for the Spanish escaped them, but they achieved something more important, which was the breaking up of the Spanish order, the scattering of the great formation that had held together so stubbornly all the way up the Channel. And once the Spanish fleet was broken and scattered, the English fell upon it. The fighting that followed, off the Flemish coast, was the hardest of the whole campaign, the English ships closing at last with the disordered Spanish vessels and pouring their fire into them through a long and bitter day. The Spanish fought with great courage and endurance, but they were scattered now, pressed against a dangerous lee shore, unable to reform, and they suffered heavily. By the end of the day, the Armada was in serious distress, several of its ships lost or driven ashore, many damaged, its formation broken, its great purpose of escorting an invading army across to England now clearly beyond achievement. And then the weather, which so often had the final word in the affairs of ships, took a hand. A change of wind drove the battered Spanish fleet away to the north, away from the Low Countries and the army it was meant to carry, away from England and any hope of accomplishing its mission, up into the cold and stormy seas of the north. And there was no way back. The only road home for the Armada now lay all the way around the British Isles, up past the coast of Scotland, and around the north and down the wild western shores of Ireland. A long and perilous passage through some of the most dangerous waters in the world, in ships already damaged and crews already worn and sickening. It was on that long road home that the Armada met its true destruction, not at the hands of the English fleet, but at the hands of the sea. As the Spanish ships made their way around the north of Britain and down past Ireland, they were caught by a succession of great storms, and the storms fell upon the damaged and ill-provisioned fleet and scattered it and drove ship after ship onto the rocks of those wild coasts. Vessel after vessel was wrecked upon the shores of Scotland and Ireland, their crews drowned in the surf or cast ashore in a strange and hostile land far from any help. The losses were terrible, and by the time the broken remnant of the Armada at last struggled back to the ports of Spain, the great fleet that had sailed so proudly to conquer England had lost a large part of its ships and a great many of its men, most of them not to English guns, but to the storms of the Northern Sea. The invasion had failed utterly. England had been saved, and the Protestant realm of Elizabeth would not be conquered, and the long contest between England and Spain, though it would continue for years yet, had passed its crisis, and the tide had turned. The English, looking upon their deliverance, were inclined to see in it the hand of God, and they struck a medal to commemorate the victory, bearing words to the effect that God had blown with his winds, and the enemy had been scattered, giving the credit for the great storm to Providence, and giving thanks for the wind that had done what the fleets alone might not have done. Drake had played his part in this great event, a leading and a celebrated part, and the defeat of the Armada stands as one of the high points of the age in which he lived and of the national story of his country. But it is worth observing, in the calm and balanced spirit of this telling, that the victory was not Drake's alone, nor even chiefly the work of the English fleet, but the combined result of many things, of the seamanship and persistence of the whole English navy, of the courage and endurance of countless men whose names are not remembered, of the strategic difficulties that beset the Spanish plan from the beginning, and above all, in the end, of the storms that finished what the fighting had begun. Drake's fame has tended to gather to itself a larger share of the credit than the strict facts perhaps allow, as the fame of celebrated men so often does, drawing into one shining name the labor and sacrifice of many. The defeat of the Armada was a national achievement and a stroke of fortune as much as it was the work of any single man. And Drake himself, for all his prominence, was one figure among many in that great and complicated event. The defeat of the Armada might have seemed the perfect note on which Drake's career should end, the celebrated raider crowning a lifetime of service to his queen by helping to turn back the greatest threat his country had ever faced. Had he died or retired in that hour of triumph, his fame would have come down to us untroubled, a story of unbroken success from the river hulk to the deck where he was knighted to the channel where the Armada was scattered. But life seldom arranges itself so neatly, and Drake's later years were not a smooth descent into honored old age, but a more difficult and uneven passage, marked by failure as well as success, by the gradual fading of his fortunes and his favor, and at last by a final voyage that ended far from home in disappointment and death. The man who would understand Drake fully must follow him past the bright summit of the Armada into the shadows that gathered around his closing years. The year after the Armada, with England still at war with Spain and the Spanish fleet broken and recovering, the English saw an opportunity to strike a decisive blow, and Drake was given command of a great expedition to carry the war back to Spain itself. The plan was ambitious in the extreme. The expedition was to destroy the remaining ships of the Armada where they lay refitting in the northern ports of Spain, to capture the city of Lisbon and raise the people of Portugal in revolt against the Spanish crown that had recently taken their kingdom. and to seize one of the islands of the eastern Atlantic as a base from which to intercept the Spanish treasure fleets, all in a single grand campaign that might, if it succeeded, cripple Spanish power for a generation. It was a fleet and an army on a scale to match these great purposes, comparable in size to the armada it was meant to answer, and great things were expected of it, for it was led by Drake, the conqueror of the South Sea and the singer of the King's Beard, the most successful sea commander of the age. The expedition was a failure. Almost nothing went as planned. The fleet did not destroy the recovering Spanish ships in their northern ports, passing them by in favor of the grander objectives further on, a decision much criticized afterward, for it left the very ships that posed the greatest future danger untouched. The attempt on Lisbon came to nothing. The hoped-for Portuguese uprising did not materialize, the city was not taken, and the English army, weakened by disease and lacking the strength and the siege equipment to force so great a city, withdrew in disappointment. Sickness ran through the crowded ships and camps and carried off men in great numbers, as it so often did in the campaigns of that age. And the survivors straggled home, having achieved almost none of the objectives for which the great expedition had been launched, having lost many men and much treasure, and having failed to deliver the decisive blow that had been hoped for. It was a serious reverse, and it fell heavily upon Drake, for the command had been his, and the failure was laid at his door. The Queen was displeased, the investors had lost their money, and the aura of invincible success that had surrounded Drake since the circumnavigation was, for the first time, broken. In the years that followed this failure, Drake found himself, for a long stretch, out of favor and out of employment. The man who had been the Queen's chosen instrument against Spain, the celebrated hero of the age, was set aside, left ashore, no longer entrusted with the great commands that had been his for so long. He retired to his estate in Devon and to the public affairs of his region, serving again in Parliament and attending to the concerns of Plymouth, the port that had been the base of all his great voyages, where he undertook works for the benefit of the town, including the bringing of fresh water to the place by a channel from the moors, a quieter and more lasting kind of service than the raiding that had made his name. He was a wealthy man still, and an honored one, but the great days seemed to be behind him. And as the years passed, it might have appeared that the sea was done with Francis Drake, that he would end his days as a country gentleman and a local worthy, his voyaging finished, his fame a thing of the past. He was no longer young. The hard life of the sea and the campaigns of decades had told upon him, and the world had moved on, and younger men had come forward to take up the war against Spain. But the war against Spain went on, and in time, the crown turned once more to its old servants, and Drake was drawn back from his retirement for one final voyage, a voyage that would carry him back to the scene of his earliest triumphs, to the Caribbean and the Isthmus of Panama, where he had first looked upon the South Sea and sworn to sail it, and that would end with his death in those same waters that had made him. The expedition was planned as a return to the old and profitable game of raiding the Spanish treasure, a great voyage to the Caribbean to seize the wealth of the Indies once again, as Drake had done in his youth. And the command was given jointly to Drake and to his old kinsman and early commander John Hawkins, the two aging veterans of the Spanish wars sent out together for one last campaign in the seas where they had begun their careers so long before. It was, in a way, a fitting circle. The two men who had been together at the disaster of San Juan de Ulua more than a quarter of a century earlier, setting out together again for the same waters, old now, their great days behind them, to try once more the enterprise that had shaped both their lives. But the world had changed in the long years since their youth, and the Spanish Empire was no longer the unsuspecting and undefended place it had been when Drake first fell upon it. And the voyage that was meant to recapture the triumphs of the past would instead become a slow and sorrowful ending. The Spanish, by this time, knew Drake well, knew his methods and his appetite for their treasure, and they had spent decades strengthening the defenses of their Caribbean possessions against exactly the kind of attack he had so often made. The ports that had once lain open were now fortified. The treasure that had once been carried carelessly was now guarded, and warning of the great English expedition reached the Caribbean well ahead of the fleet, so that the Spanish were ready and waiting when Drake and Hawkins arrived. The element of surprise that had been the foundation of all Drake's earlier successes was entirely gone, and against prepared and fortified defenses, the old methods failed. The expedition went wrong almost from the start. The early attempts against Spanish targets in the islands were repulsed or yielded little, and the fleet found the wealth it sought locked away behind defenses too strong to break. And then, as so often in those waters, disease came among the crowded ships, the fevers of the tropics that had always been the deadliest enemy in those campaigns. And the sickness began to work its way through the fleet, and among those it struck was the old commander John Hawkins, who fell ill and died at sea off the coast, near the very waters where, with Drake, he had suffered the great disaster of his youth, so many years before. The first of the two old comrades was gone, dead of fever on the sea that had shaped his life, and Drake sailed on without him, the last of the pair, toward his own ending. Drake pressed on with the failing expedition, trying to recover something from a voyage that had gone wrong at every turn, and he set his hopes upon the old prize that had drawn him to those seas in the very beginning. The treasure of Panama, carried across the isthmus as it had been when he ambushed it as a young man in the forest. He meant to seize the town that guarded the Caribbean end of the crossing, and to take the silver of Peru as he had taken it long before. But here too the Spanish were ready. They had learned over the decades exactly how Drake fought and exactly where he would strike, and they had prepared the defenses of the isthmus against him. When the English landed and set out to cross the mountainous country toward the treasure, they found the way blocked and defended, the paths guarded, the strong points fortified and held against them, and the climate and the country, the same dense and difficult forest that had once concealed his allies and aided his ambush, now worked against the aging Drake and his weary men. The attempt to cross to the treasure failed. The English were turned back, exhausted and beaten, having accomplished nothing, and the great prize that Drake had hoped to seize one final time remained beyond his reach, locked behind defenses that his old boldness could no longer overcome. It was after this final failure that the sickness which had taken Hawkins came also for Drake. The same fevers and fluxes that ran through the fleet, the diseases of the crowded ships and the tropical climate against which the medicine of the age was helpless, took hold of the old commander, and he began to fail. He was struck, by the accounts that survive, with the same kind of illness that carried off so many in those campaigns, a wasting and weakening sickness of the kind that the men of that time understood little and could do almost nothing to treat. And as the days passed, it became clear that the man who had survived the strait and the storm and the reef and the guns of the Spanish Empire, who had sailed around the whole world and come home against every probability, was not going to survive this. He lay ill aboard his ship, off the coast near the town of Portobello on the Isthmus of Panama, in the very waters where his great adventure had begun so long before, and his strength ebbed, and those around him understood that the end was near. There is a story, often repeated, that in his final hours, in the wandering of his fever, the old sailor called for his armor, wishing, it was said, to die as a soldier and a fighter, rather than weak and abed, to meet death dressed for the battle that had been the work of his life. Whether this is true or one of the many tales that gathered around his death, it has the ring of the man as the legend remembered him, defiant to the last, unwilling to go quietly. What is certain is that early one morning, in the closing days of January, in the year 1596, aboard his ship off the coast of Panama, Sir Francis Drake died. The boy from the River Hulk, the raider of the South Sea, the man who had sailed around the world and singed the King of Spain's beard and helped to scatter the Great Armada, came to his end far from home. In the tropical waters where his fame had been born, his last great voyage a failure, the treasure he had sought once more beyond his grasp. Dying of a common fever in a strange sea, as so many sailors of his age died. Far from the green hills of Devon, where his long journey had begun. His men buried him at sea, as was the way with sailors who died upon the ocean. They placed his body in a coffin of lead, the heavy metal that would carry it down and hold it, and they took the coffin out into the bay near Portobello, and there, with such ceremony as a fleet at war could offer, with the firing of guns and the solemn words of the burial service, they committed the body of their commander to the sea. The lead coffin slipped beneath the surface and sank down into the warm waters of the Caribbean, into the very sea that had made him and that he had ranged for the better part of his life. And it settled into the deep, and the place of it was lost. Somewhere in the waters off the coast of Panama, in a lead coffin on the floor of the sea, the body of Francis Drake has lain ever since, and no one has ever found it. In the centuries that followed, there have been those who dreamed of finding it, divers and searchers drawn by the romance of recovering the bones of so famous a man. And from time to time the search is taken up again. The bay swept for the heavy coffin that must lie somewhere in its depths. But the sea keeps its secrets, and the coffin has never been found. And Drake remains where his men left him, in the deep water of the Caribbean. The sea his grave as it had been his element, and his road to fortune, and his ending all at once. It is a fitting resting place, perhaps, for a man whose whole life was bound up with the sea, who was born within sound of the tide, and made his name upon the ocean, and met his death upon it, and now lies forever beneath it. The land remembers him with monuments and names and stories, but the man himself belongs to the sea, given back to it at the last, dissolved into the element that had carried him around the world. There is a quietness to that ending, after all the noise and triumph and controversy of his life. The great raider sinking at last into silence in the warm and indifferent water. The guns falling still, the ships sailing away, the place of his grave forgotten, the sea closing over him as it closes over all who are given to it, keeping him as it keeps the marigold and her lost company, and all the countless others who have gone down into it across the long history of human voyaging. The empire he had robbed outlived him. The queen he had served outlived him. The war he had waged went on after him. But Drake himself passed into the deep and into legend, and the two have held him ever since. The expedition that he died commanding limped home without him. Having achieved little, its great hopes ended in failure and disease, and the deaths of both its famous leaders. It was a sorrowful conclusion to the long story of Drake's wars against Spain. A reminder that even the most celebrated careers do not always end in triumph. That the man who had begun by taking the wealth of an empire almost at will, ended by failing against an enemy that had learned, at last, how to defend itself against him. But the failure of his final voyage did nothing to dim the fame of all that had gone before. By the time of his death, Drake was already a legend, his name known throughout Europe, celebrated in England as one of the great men of the age, and feared and reviled throughout the Spanish world as the most dangerous of all the enemies the empire had faced. The circumstances of his death, far away and in defeat, only added a note of melancholy grandeur to the legend. The great adventurer dying in the seas of his youth, buried in the deep, his grave unknown, his story complete. In the centuries since his death, the memory of Francis Drake has been shaped and reshaped many times, for he is one of those figures whose story has been told differently by different peoples and different ages, each finding in him what it wished to find. To the English of his own time, and for long afterward, he was a national hero of the first rank. The bold sea captain who had humbled the great empire of Spain, who had carried the flag of his small island realm around the entire world, who had helped to turn back the Armada and to win for England a place among the great powers of the sea. His name was given to straits and bays and ships and towns across the world. His exploits taught to generations of children as examples of courage and enterprise. His legend polished and burnished until it shone with an almost untarnished glory. He became a symbol of his nation's reach and daring, the very embodiment of the seafaring spirit that would, in the centuries after him, carry English ships and English power to every corner of the globe. In that telling, the troubling parts of his story faded into the background or vanished altogether, and what remained was the hero, the adventurer, the patriot, the man who had robbed an empire and come home to be knighted by his queen. But that is not the only way his story has been told, and a calm and honest account must give room to the others. To the Spanish, both in his own day and after, Drake was no hero but a pirate and a tormentor, a man who had plundered their ships and burned their towns and taken their treasure, who had killed their people and defied their laws, the very figure of the heretic raider who had preyed upon their empire for decades. They had a name for him that expressed their fear and their hatred, calling him by a word that cast him as a kind of dragon, a creature of menace prowling their seas. And Spanish mothers, it was said, frightened their children with his name. To them, the deeds that the English celebrated as glorious were simply the crimes of a successful robber, and the knighting of Drake by his queen was not an honor but an outrage, the open endorsement by one crown of acts of war and theft against another. And in this view too there is truth, for Drake did take what was not his, did make war for profit, did plunder and burn and kill in the pursuit of treasure. And the line between a privateer and a pirate has always been a matter of which side one stands upon, drawn by the flag a man sails under rather than by the nature of his deeds. And there is a further reckoning that more recent times have brought to the story, one that the older tellings, both English and Spanish, passed over too lightly. For Francis Drake, before he was the hero of the circumnavigation or the scourge of the Spanish Main, was a trader in human beings, a participant in the early English ventures into the traffic in enslaved people that he had carried across the ocean in the holds of Hawkins's ships in his youth. This is a part of his story that cannot be set aside in the honest reckoning that a thoughtful age requires, for it places him at the beginning of one of the great wrongs of history, among the first of his nation to take part in a commerce in human lives that would grow into something vast and terrible. The same man whose courage and skill the English celebrated had begun his career by carrying captured Africans into bondage, and no account that wishes to be truthful can celebrate the one while forgetting the other. He was, like so many of the celebrated figures of the past, a man of genuine ability and genuine courage who was also bound up in the cruelties and the crimes of his age. And to remember him rightly is to hold all of these things together, the daring and the cruelty, the achievement and the wrong, without letting either erase the other. For this is the difficulty and the lesson of a life like Drake's, that it refuses to be simple, that it will not resolve into the clean shape of either pure heroism or pure villainy, but remains, like most human lives examined closely, a tangle of the admirable and the terrible. He was brave beyond question, and skilled beyond almost any sailor of his age, and his voyage around the world was a feat of seamanship and endurance, and will that deserves the wonder it has always inspired. He was also a raider who lived by taking what belonged to others, and a man who began his career in the trade in human lives, and a commander who removed a rival by something very near to judicial murder on a desolate shore at the bottom of the world. All of these are true together, And the truth of him lies not in choosing among them, but in holding them all, in seeing the whole man as he was. Neither the unblemished hero of the old English legend, nor the simple monster of the Spanish curse, but a figure of his particular and complicated time, capable of greatness and of wrong in the same breath, as so many are. And what of the things he touched and the world he helped to make? The treasure he brought home enriched his crown and his country, and helped, in some small but real measure, to set England upon the path that would lead it, in the centuries after him, to become a great power of the seas and the builder of an empire of its own, an empire that would carry both the achievements and the wrongs of its founding spirit to every part of the world. The route around the bottom of the Americas that the great storm had revealed to him would in time bear the name of Drake, the passage of open water below the last of the land where the oceans meet, a wild and stormy strait that ships would learn to use, and that carries his name still on the charts of the world, a quiet memorial in geography to the man who was driven across it against his will. The little ship that carried him around the world rotted away on her riverbank and was broken up. But her name and her image endured, and the chair made from her timbers sits still in its place of honor, and replicas of her have been built in later ages and sailed upon the sea, small wooden vessels that let people marvel again at how slight a thing it was that carried Drake around the globe. And his name lives on, attached to 1,000 places and stories, celebrated and contested, polished and questioned, as it has been for more than 400 years. But beyond all the arguments over his memory, beyond the hero and the pirate and the slaver and the legend, there remains the simple and the human fact of the man himself, who was born within sound of the tide and who gave his whole life to the sea and who lies now beneath it. There is something in that ending that quiets all the controversy, that reduces the great and contested figure to the same small and mortal thing that every sailor becomes who is given at last to the deep. Somewhere off the coast of Panama, in the warm and indifferent water, in a coffin of lead that has never been found, the bones of Francis Drake have lain for more than 4 centuries, while the world above has remembered and forgotten and remembered him again. While empires he served and empires he robbed have risen and fallen, while the ships have grown from small wooden vessels into things of steel beyond his imagining, while the very seas he sailed have been charted and crossed 10,000 times over. The sea that made him keeps him still, and asks nothing of his memory, and renders no verdict upon his deeds, but holds him in its depths as it holds all the others, the celebrated and the forgotten alike, the heroes and the wrongdoers, and the countless ordinary souls who have gone down into it across the long ages of human voyaging upon the water. The sea does not remember as the land remembers, with monuments and arguments and the endless reshaping of reputation. The sea simply keeps. It kept the Marigold and her lost company who cried out in the southern storm and were never seen again. It kept John Hawkins, dead of fever on the same waters where his troubles had begun, given to the deep before his old comrade followed him. It kept the men of the Great Armada, drowned in their hundreds upon the rocks of Scotland and Ireland, far from the warm coasts of Spain. And it keeps Francis Drake, the boy from the River Hulk, who reached out and took the wealth of an empire and sailed around the whole turning world. Lying now in his lead coffin in the deep off Panama, his grave unknown, his long voyage ended, the water closing over him as it closes over everything in time. The tide that rocked the abandoned hull where he was a child still rises and falls along the shores of Devon, and the great ocean he ranged still rolls around the world. He was among the first to circle, and somewhere beneath it, in the silence and the dark and the patient keeping of the sea, the most celebrated and the most contested mariner of his age rests on, beyond all reach of fame or judgment, where the water has held him since the morning his men gave him to the deep. If these long and quiet voyages into the history of the sea have brought you some measure of peace tonight, and if you would like to drift off again on another evening to another lost story carried gently across the water, you are warmly welcome to stay with the channel and let us sail together once more. Rest now and let the sound of the sea carry you down into sleep, and we will be here with another voyage whenever you wish to return.